Fairfield County, Connecticut. March 2023. What would you do if your 6-year-old son touched an ancient Roman coin and woke up speaking a language dead for 2,000 years? Sarah Collins, an elementary school teacher, was about to find out that some memories refuse to stay buried, even across the vast expanse of millennia. It was supposed to be a routine school field trip. The Museum of Ancient Civilizations in Hartford had opened a new exhibition on Roman commerce, and John Collins, just 6 years old, had begged his mother to come along as a chaperone. He was a typical American boy who loved dinosaurs, played video games, and had never shown any interest in history. But when the tour guide led the children past a glass case displaying replica Roman coins, something impossible happened. John reached out and touched the cool metal surface of a denarius, a silver coin from 78 AD. The moment his small fingers made contact, his body went rigid. His blue eyes rolled back. The other children screamed as John collapsed to the marble floor, his small body convulsing violently. The museum staff called 911 while Sarah cradled her son's head, feeling his skull crack against the hard ground. For 47 seconds that felt like hours. John's mouth moved, whispering words in a guttural ancient tongue no child should know. When the paramedics arrived, John's eyes finally opened. But the boy who looked up at his terrified mother was different. The childish wonder was gone, replaced by something ancient, something impossibly old. In perfect Latin, words flowing like water from his small mouth, John spoke his first sentence. Domum redire volo, Marcus Valerius sum. Sarah didn't speak Latin, but later, when Dr. Elena Rossi from Yale translated the recording, the blood drained from her face. I want to go home. I am Marcus Valerius. A dead merchant was speaking through a living child, and he had been waiting 2,000 years to tell his story. Before we continue, please consider subscribing to the channel and letting us know where you're watching from. We read every single comment and truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to the story. Sarah Collins felt her world shatter the moment her son's body hit the museum floor. The sound echoed through the Roman Empire gallery like a gunshot. John's small frame convulsed violently, his limbs jerking in rhythms that made the other children scream and back away in terror. His teacher, Mrs. Peterson, fumbled for her phone with shaking hands while Sarah dropped to her knees, cradling John's head to prevent it from cracking against the unforgiving marble. Foam appeared at the corners of his mouth. His eyes had rolled so far back that only the whites showed, blank and terrifying. And then came the sounds. Low, guttural words poured from John's lips in a language Sarah had never heard. The syllables were harsh, ancient, completely foreign to a 6-year-old boy from suburban Connecticut. The words came, faster, more urgent, as if John was trying desperately to communicate something vital before time ran out. Museum security arrived first, then paramedics. By the time the ambulance screamed through Hartford traffic toward Connecticut Children's Medical Center, John had been seizing for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the longest 4 minutes of Sarah's life. Michael met them at the emergency room, his face drained of color. Their son was rushed into imaging. CT scans, MRI, EEG monitoring. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the attending neurologist, ran every test in her arsenal. She checked for epilepsy, brain tumors, infections, metabolic disorders, anything that could explain the violent seizure. Hours crawled by. Test results came back one by one. Brain scans revealed absolutely nothing abnormal. No lesions, no anomalies, no structural damage whatsoever. Blood work was perfect, glucose levels normal, no toxins, no drugs, no infections. John's brain was completely, impossibly healthy. When John finally opened his eyes at 6:47 p.m., Sarah was holding his hand, whispering prayers she had not spoken since childhood. The boy looked directly at his mother, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Something was different, profoundly, terrifyingly different. John's eyes held a depth, a weariness, an ancient quality that no child should possess. Then he spoke. The words were clear, deliberate, spoken with perfect pronunciation. Mater, ubi sum? Sarah did not understand Latin, but she would never forget those words. The Collins family returned home from the hospital with medical discharge papers that explained nothing. Dr. Morrison had found no neurological damage, no reason for the seizure, no explanation for the Latin words. She recommended rest and a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. But rest was impossible, because 3 days after the museum incident, John sat at the kitchen table with his box of crayons and began to draw. What emerged on the paper made Sarah's hands tremble. John was sketching a detailed architectural map with a precision that should be impossible for a 6-year-old child. The lines were straight, the proportions accurate, the perspective sophisticated. He drew streets, buildings, columned structures, what appeared to be a massive plaza. He labeled locations in careful block letters: Forum Boreum, Vicus Tuscus, Porticus Aemilia. Sarah watched in silent horror as her son created a map of ancient Rome with the confidence of a city planner. But these were not locations from any children's book or school lesson. When Michael came home from work and saw the drawings spread across the dining room table, he felt his rational worldview beginning to crack. That night, John refused to answer to his own name. "I am Marcus Valerius," he insisted with an adult firmness that made his parents exchange terrified glances. Over the following days, the boy described his life in vivid, specific detail. He talked about his shop near the Forum Boreum, where he sold olive oil and wine imported from Hispania and Gaul. He described the weight and texture of amphorae, the clay vessels used to transport liquids in the ancient world. He recounted the smell of the merchant quarter, a mixture of fish from the Tiber, burning oil lamps, human sweat, and spilled wine that created an overwhelming sensory assault. He named customers, described their faces, recounted price negotiations with a businessman's precision. He knew the exchange rates between denarii and sesterces. He explained the difference between various grades of olive oil with technical knowledge no child should possess. Sarah and Michael were caught between wonder and absolute terror. Michael Collins was a man who believed in data, evidence, and logical explanations. He was a software engineer who had spent his entire career solving problems through reason and systematic analysis. He refused to accept that his son was somehow possessed by the soul of a dead Roman merchant. There had to be a rational explanation. He tore through John's browsing history on the family iPad, searching for ancient Rome videos or educational games. Nothing. He interrogated Mrs. Peterson about the museum curriculum, demanding to know exactly what the tour guide had said about Roman commerce. She insisted the tour had been basic, child-level information about coins and trade. Michael even hired a child psychologist, Dr. Raymond Chen, who spent 3 sessions with John and concluded the boy showed no signs of dissociative disorder, false memory syndrome, or any psychiatric condition that could explain the detailed historical knowledge. Sarah, however, felt the truth in her bones. She was a woman of faith who attended church every Sunday, who believed in mysteries beyond human understanding. Something supernatural had happened to their son when he touched that Roman coin. Something ancient and powerful had awakened inside John's small body. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in the strange adult cadence of his speech. This was not imagination or absorbed information. This was real. The marriage began to fracture under the crushing weight of the inexplicable. Michael and Sarah argued in heated whispers after John went to bed, their voices sharp with fear and frustration. Meanwhile, John grew increasingly agitated and distressed. He paced the house like a caged animal, repeatedly crying that he needed to return to the Forum, that something crucial remained unfinished. He would wake screaming in the middle of the night, describing his death with chilling clarity. Trapped in his burning shop, smoke filling his lungs, the chaos in the streets as people fled some approaching catastrophe. He did not know then about Vesuvius, but he remembered the fear, the certainty that the world was ending. He recalled specific prices: olive oil at 12 sesterces per amphora, wine at 20 for the imported Falernian variety. Sarah Collins made the call to Yale University on a Friday afternoon, her voice shaking as she tried to explain the situation to the secretary in the Department of Classical Languages. She expected to be dismissed as a delusional parent, but the secretary transferred her to Dr. Elena Rossi, a distinguished professor who had spent 40 years studying ancient Latin dialects. Dr. Rossi agreed to visit the following week, her tone professional but skeptical. She had heard these claims before, parents convinced their children possessed supernatural abilities. They always had rational explanations. She arrived at the Collins home on a grey Tuesday morning, carrying a leather briefcase filled with Latin texts, audio recordings, and assessment materials. She was a small woman in her mid-60s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She expected this to take an hour, maybe less. She would test the child, identify the source of the mimicry, reassure the worried parents, and return to New Haven. But the moment John Collins walked into the living room and looked at her, Dr. Rossi felt something shift in the air. The boy studied her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Then he spoke. Not in English, but in flowing, fluent Latin. But this was not the cleaned-up classical Latin she taught to Yale undergraduates. This was vulgar Latin, the rough merchant dialect spoken in the streets and markets of ancient Rome. The pronunciation was perfect, the regional accent unmistakable. John used colloquial expressions that appeared only in graffiti preserved on the walls of Pompeii, crude phrases about commerce and competition that no academic text contained. Dr. Rossi found herself responding in Latin automatically, and John answered with ease, discussing the price fluctuations of olive oil imports from Baetica, explaining the credit arrangements between merchants and ship captains, describing the insurance practices that protected cargo against storms and pirates. The boy's vocabulary was technical, precise, filled with terminology that even Dr. Rossi had to research in specialized economic histories of the Roman Empire. Her hands began to tremble. She had devoted her entire career to studying dead languages, to reconstructing how ancient people spoke and thought. And now a 6-year-old child from Connecticut was speaking with the fluency and knowledge of someone who had actually lived in ancient Rome. Dr. Elena Rossi sat in her Yale office 3 days later, staring at her notes from the Collins interview. Her hands still trembled when she thought about the conversation she had conducted entirely in vulgar Latin with a 6-year-old child. She needed validation, a second opinion from someone whose skepticism was even more formidable than her own. She picked up her phone and called Dr. James Hartford. Dr. Hartford was a legend in archaeological circles, a specialist in Roman urban planning and commerce whose reputation for debunking sensational claims was well established. He had spent his career exposing frauds, dismissing conspiracy theories, and defending rigorous academic standards against pseudoscientific nonsense. When Dr. Rossi explained the situation, he laughed. But she persisted, and his curiosity eventually overcame his skepticism. He agreed to visit Connecticut the following weekend. Dr. Hartford arrived at the Collins home expecting to spend an hour exposing whatever trick or misunderstanding had fooled his colleague. He was a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone who had never encountered a mystery he could not solve. John Collins was waiting in the living room with blank paper and colored pencils. Without any prompting, without any questions asked, the boy began to draw. What emerged over the next 20 minutes was an intricate, detailed map of a merchant district near the Forum Boarium. The precision was remarkable. John labeled streets, marked the positions of specific shops, drew the curve of the Tiber River with accurate proportions. He pointed to one location and stated flatly, "My shop was here, 3 doors from the corner where the Vicus Tuscus met the embankment." Then John began naming the neighboring merchants. Gaius Publius, who sold fish caught fresh from the river each morning. Titus Flavius, who imported fabric from Egypt and complained constantly about customs taxes. Decimus Aurelius, the baker, whose bread John claimed was mediocre but affordable. He described their families, their personalities, their business practices with intimate familiarity. Dr. Hartford felt his professional skepticism beginning to crack. Dr. Hartford sat at the Collins family dining room table, his laptop open, cross-referencing John's detailed descriptions with fragmentary tax records preserved in the Vatican archives. The database contained partial merchant registries from 78 AD, incomplete documents that had survived 2 millennia through luck and careful preservation. His fingers trembled as he typed the search parameters. Then the screen populated with results. His blood turned to ice. There, in faded Latin script photographed from an ancient papyrus fragment, was the entry. Emsia Valerius, negotiator Olei et Vini, Vicus Tuscus proper forum Boarium. Marcus Valerius, dealer in oil and wine, Vicus Tuscus near the forum Boarium. The exact location John had drawn. The neighboring merchants listed matched the names the boy had provided. Gaius Publius, Titus Flavius, Decimus Aurelius. Every single detail corresponded perfectly. Dr. Hartford looked at Dr. Rossi, his legendary skepticism shattered. They were witnessing something that violated every principle of science, history, and rational thought they had devoted their lives to upholding. 2 accomplished academics sat in stunned silence, unable to speak, unable to deny what their own research had confirmed. Michael Collins watched the experts' faces drain of color and felt his entire worldview collapse. He was a man who believed in code, in algorithms, in problems that could be solved through logic. But logic could not explain his son speaking a dead language or knowing details from fragmentary historical records he could never have accessed. Meanwhile, John grew increasingly urgent and agitated. He paced the living room, his small hands clenched into fists, repeating the same phrase over and over. "The truth is buried beneath the black stone. I hid everything before the fire came, the most precious things. They are still there, waiting." He spoke with adult desperation that made Sarah's heart break. Dr. Hartford made a decision. He had contacts at the Soprintendenza Archeologica di Roma, the Italian archaeological authority responsible for excavations in the ancient city. He composed a carefully worded email, framing the request as an investigation based on newly discovered historical documents rather than the testimony of a 6-year-old boy claiming to remember a past life. 2 weeks later, the Collins family boarded a flight from JFK to Leonardo da Vinci International Airport in Rome. Sarah held John's hand as they walked through the terminal, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. Michael followed behind, carrying luggage and doubts in equal measure. Dr. Rossi and Dr. Hartford had booked seats on the same flight, their academic reputations now staked on the impossible claim that a 6-year-old boy possessed authentic memories from ancient Rome. The flight was 8 hours of tense silence. John stared out the window, watching clouds drift past, and whispered repeatedly in Latin about going home. When they landed in Rome and emerged from the airport into the Italian sunlight, something extraordinary happened. John's entire demeanor changed. The agitation and confusion that had plagued him for weeks vanished, replaced by calm certainty. He looked around the modern city with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was, despite never having set foot in Italy before. As their taxi drove toward the hotel, John suddenly became animated, pointing out the window and speaking rapidly. He used the curves of the Tiber River as reference points, tracking their position with absolute precision. When they passed modern buildings, he grew visibly distressed, explaining in Italian he should not know what structures belonged in those spaces instead. A temple to Hercules, a warehouse for grain storage, a public bath complex. The taxi driver glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, unsettled by the small American child speaking flawless Italian with an archaic accent. The next morning, they met Dr. Claudia Ferrara and her team from the Soprintendenza Archeologica at the archaeological zone near the Forum Boreum. Dr. Ferrara was a serious woman in her 40s who had reluctantly agreed to this investigation based on Dr. Hartford's reputation. She watched with bemused skepticism as the American family approached with their small son. John walked directly to a specific section of the excavation site, his steps confident, purposeful. He moved like a man returning home after a long absence, navigating the ancient stones and modern barriers with unnatural certainty. John Collins walked directly to a section of exposed foundation stones, his small finger pointing downward with absolute certainty. The Italian archaeological team gathered around, their faces mixing professional curiosity with obvious skepticism. Then the boy spoke in perfect Italian, his accent carrying the regional inflections of ancient Latium that no language course taught. 3 metri sotto, he said with adult authority, beneath the black stone foundation. 3 meters down beneath the black stone foundation. Dr. Ferrara exchanged glances with her colleagues. This was either an elaborate hoax or something that defied rational explanation. But Dr. Hartford's credentials were impeccable, and the preliminary research had been compelling enough to justify this investigation. She gave the order to begin excavation. The team established a careful grid, documenting every layer as they dug. Modern soil gave way to medieval debris, then Renaissance-era fill. Deeper still, distinct Roman-era layers began to emerge. Pottery shards, building materials, the compressed soil that indicated ancient street level. Then, at approximately 2 meters depth, the excavation revealed burned remains, charred wooden beams, heat-cracked stone, the unmistakable evidence of catastrophic fire. The team worked with increasing excitement as first-century commercial structures emerged from the earth. Roman coins scattered in the soil, their silver surfaces tarnished by time. Broken amphorae shards still carried the faint residue of olive oil, preserved for nearly 2,000 years. Clay roof tiles bearing the stamps of ancient manufacturers. Then, at precisely 3 meters depth, exactly where John had indicated, beneath a foundation stone of dark volcanic rock, the team uncovered something that made Dr. Ferrara stop breathing. A merchant seal. Bronze, corroded but intact, bearing clear Latin lettering pressed into its surface. Mr. Valerius. The team stood in stunned silence. Dr. Hartford felt tears streaming down his face without shame. Dr. Rossi covered her mouth with both hands. Sarah Collins embraced her son, who watched the excavation with calm satisfaction. But John insisted they continue digging. "Deeper," he commanded in Italian. "The strongbox is below the seal. I buried it the night before the fire came." The strongbox was carefully extracted from the earth, its metal surface corroded, but structurally intact. Dr. Ferrara ordered it transported immediately to the conservation laboratory at the Soprintendenza offices. The team worked under controlled conditions, documenting every step with photographs and detailed notes. When the corroded lock was finally opened 3 days later, the contents took everyone's breath away. Inside, protected from moisture and decay by the metal container and the specific soil conditions, were preserved wax tablet ledgers. Ancient accounting records, their surfaces still bearing the impressions of a stylus that had last touched them in 79 AD. personal items emerged as the conservators carefully removed each object. A gold family ring engraved with initials. Ceremonial merchants' weights calibrated precisely to Roman standards. A small bronze household shrine statue depicting Mercurius, the god of commerce, and Vesta, goddess of hearth and home. Before the archaeologists could catalogue or identify any item, John called out their significance. He became visibly emotional, tears streaming down his 6-year-old face as memories flooded back with overwhelming force. He picked up the gold ring with trembling hands and whispered in Latin, his voice breaking. Annulus fili mei erat, mortus est quatuor annos natus, febris ium cepit. The ring was for my son. He died at 4 years old. Fever took him. Sarah Collins held her weeping child as he explained each object through sobs. The weights were his father's, passed down when Marcus took over the family business. The shrine statue stood in the corner of his shop, where he made offerings every morning for protection and prosperity. The ledgers contained his life's work, every transaction, every profit and loss. Dr. Ferrara examined the wax tablets with shaking hands. The dates spanned 78 to 79 AD. The final entry was recorded on August 20th, 79 AD. Historical records documented a major fire in that district on August 23rd, 79 AD, just 3 days later. The writing style matched perfectly with other merchant documents from the period. The accounting methods, the abbreviations, the personal notations about difficult customers and outstanding debts, everything corresponded exactly to John's descriptions. After the strongbox discovery was authenticated and secured in the museum's climate-controlled vault, something unexpected began happening to John Collins. The memories that had possessed him so completely for weeks started fading like dreams dissolving in morning light. It began subtly. John stopped speaking Latin during meals. He no longer corrected his parents when they called him by his own name instead of Marcus Valerius. The architectural drawings ceased. Within 3 days of returning to their Rome hotel, he asked his mother what language those funny old people had been speaking at the excavation site. Sarah realized with heartbreak that her son was forgetting Italian entirely. By the time they boarded their flight back to Connecticut, John remembered the entire Rome trip, only as a fun vacation where we dug in the dirt. He talked excitedly about the airplane food and the hotel swimming pool. When Dr. Rossi tested him one final time, speaking to him in Latin, John looked at her with complete confusion and asked, "Why are you talking so weird?" The language had vanished from his mind as mysteriously and completely as it had appeared. Marcus, Valerius was gone. The artifacts were authenticated by 3 independent laboratories in Rome, Oxford, and Berlin. Carbon dating confirmed the materials dated to the 1st century AD. The writing on the ledgers matched other merchant documents from the period. The gold ring's metallurgical composition was consistent with Roman goldsmithing techniques. Every test confirmed the impossible truth. The collection was transferred to the National Roman Museum, where it opened as a permanent exhibit titled The Marcus Valerius Discovery, Evidence of Soul Memory. Michael Collins returned to Connecticut a fundamentally changed man. His rational worldview had been shattered beyond any possibility of repair. He could no longer trust that the universe operated solely according to measurable, predictable laws. Mystery and possibility had invaded his life, and he found himself attending church with Sarah for the first time in years. Sarah discovered a profound, unshakable peace. The confirmation that the human soul was eternal, that consciousness transcended individual lifetimes, gave her a comfort no theology had ever provided. Dr. James Hartford published his findings 6 months later in the Journal of Roman Studies, co-authored with Dr. Elena Rossi and Dr. Claudia Ferrara. The paper, titled Anomalous Historical Knowledge in a Minor, the Marcus Valerius Case, became the most downloaded article in the journal's history. International media exploded with the story. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, every major news outlet covered what they called scientific proof of reincarnation. The Marcus Valerius collection opened as a permanent exhibit at the National Roman Museum in Rome. Visitors from around the world lined up for hours to see the ledgers, the gold ring, the merchant's seal, physical evidence that consciousness might survive death and return in new forms. Meanwhile, John Collins grew up completely normal in suburban Connecticut. He played Little League baseball, struggled with algebra homework, went to high school dances, and eventually attended college to study business. He retained absolutely no memory of those weeks when he spoke Latin and drew maps of ancient Rome. When reporters occasionally tracked him down for interviews, he would smile politely and say he remembered nothing except a fun family vacation to Italy when he was little. But Sarah and Michael Collins carried the weight and wonder of what they had witnessed for the rest of their lives. They never spoke publicly about the experience, but it marked them permanently. Those weeks when ancient Rome spoke through their son, when the impossible became undeniable, had changed them forever. So what do you think? Press 1 in the comments if you believe John truly remembered a past life as Marcus Valerius. Press 2 if you think there is still a rational explanation science has not discovered. And if this story moved you, if it made you question what you thought you knew about life and death, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We explore mysteries like this every week, because the truth is, consciousness remains the deepest mystery in existence. Souls journey across vast expanses of time, carrying memories buried so deep we forget they exist. But sometimes, in rare moments, those memories surface, and they remind us that death is not the end, but merely a transition in an eternal cycle.